What do a Roman general, a Chinese empress, and a failed Austrian artist have in common? They're all card-carrying members of the "Oops, I grabbed too much power" club. Here, we'll unravel 10 of history's most audacious power grabs that went hilariously, terribly wrong. Ever wondered how not to take over the world? Stick around, we've got plenty of examples. Julius Caesar's crossing the Rubicon. In 49 BCE, Rome was a powder keg. The Senate, led by Pompey, ordered Julius Caesar to disband his army and return home. Caesar had other plans. On January 10th, Caesar stood at the banks of the Rubicon, a small river marking the boundary between Italy and Gaul. Crossing it with an army? Illegal. Big no-no. Treason, actually. Caesar, ever the drama queen, reportedly said, "The die is cast." Then he and his single legion, about 5,000 men, splashed across. Fun fact, this tiny river caused a giant headache for Rome. It was so small, Caesar probably got his feet wet crossing it. Talk about a bad day to forget your galoshes. Now, Caesar wasn't just taking a leisurely stroll. He was gunning for Rome, 200 miles away. His opponent, Pompey, had a bigger army, but made a rookie mistake. He panicked and fled the city. Caesar's march to Rome was like a triumphal parade. Towns opened their gates. More soldiers joined him. By the time he reached the capital, his army had swelled to 300,000 men. Here's the kicker. When Caesar entered Rome, he found it empty. No epic battle, no resistance. Just a bunch of confused cats probably wondering where all the humans went. Caesar didn't waste time. He raided the treasury, grabbed the gold, and set off after Pompey. The civil war was on, baby. But here's the irony. Caesar's power grab worked until it didn't. 5 years later, on March 15th, 44 BCE, Caesar met his end. Not on a battlefield, but in the Senate, stabbed 23 times by his own allies. Caesar's last words? Probably not "et tu, brute." More likely, he said something in Greek that translates to, "You too, child?" So, Caesar crossed a stream and ended up drowning in a sea of daggers. His power grab reshaped Rome, but ultimately cost him his life. Talk about a dice roll gone wrong. Empress Wuon's rise to power, 690 CE. Wuon started as a low-ranking concubine in Emperor Taizong's court, but she wasn't content with just being another pretty face in the harem. At 14, Wu caught the eye of Taizong's son, Li Ji. When Taizong died in 649, Wu should have become a Buddhist nun, as was the custom. Instead, she caught a ride back to the palace with Li Ji, now Emperor Gaozong. Wu quickly became Gaozong's favorite concubine. In 655, she allegedly killed her own infant daughter and framed Empress Wuon for the crime. Cold? Absolutely. Effective? You bet. Wu became the new empress. Gaozong suffered a stroke in 660, leaving Wu as the power behind the throne. She ruled through him and later through her sons for 15 years. In 690, at the ripe age of 65, Wu said, "Screw it, I'm doing this myself." She declared herself emperor. Not empress, mind you, but emperor. She even invented a new Chinese character for her reign title, Zhao, meaning shining. Wu's reign was a mixed bag. She expanded the empire, improved agriculture, and lowered taxes. But she also had a network of secret police and wasn't shy about offing her opponents. One of her more creative punishments? The human swine treatment. Offenders had their arms and legs chopped off, were force-fed alcohol and drugs, and left to wallow in their own filth. Harsh. Wu's power grab lasted 15 years. In 705, at age 80, she was forced to abdicate. She died later that year, probably muttering, "I would have gotten away with it too if it weren't for those meddling nobles." Wu Zetian remains the only woman in Chinese history to rule in her own right. She grabbed power with both hands and held on tight for half a century. Not bad for a concubine who was supposed to end up as a nun. William the Conqueror's Norman invasion. William, Duke of Normandy, had a chip on his shoulder. He claimed Edward the Confessor, King of England, promised him the throne. When Edward died in January 1066, the crown went to Harold Godwinson instead. William wasn't pleased. On September 28, 1066, William landed in England with 7,000 men. Harold was up north, fighting off a Viking invasion. Talk about bad timing. William's invasion force wasn't huge, but it packed a punch. He brought 2,000 horses, including heavy cavalry, a game-changer in medieval warfare. Meanwhile, Harold marched his army 250 miles in just 4 days. That's some serious hustle. On October 14th, the two forces met at Hastings. The battle lasted from dawn to dusk. Harold's army, mostly infantry, held their ground on a hill. William's troops charged uphill repeatedly. Not the smartest tactic, but William had an ace up his sleeve: feigned retreats. William's cavalry would attack, then pretend to flee. Harold's men would chase them, breaking formation. Then the Normans would turn and cut them down. Sneaky. The turning point? Harold took an arrow to the eye. Ouch. His death broke the English resolve, and by nightfall, William was victorious. On Christmas Day 1066, William was crowned King of England. He didn't speak a word of English. The coronation crowd cheered so loudly that his Norman guards, thinking it was an uprising, set fire to nearby houses. Some welcome party. William's power grab changed England forever. He replaced the Anglo-Saxon nobility with Normans, built castles across the country, and even commissioned the Domesday Book, a massive survey of his new kingdom. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. William spent years putting down rebellions. He became so frustrated with northern England that he laid waste to it in the harrying of the north. Thousands died of starvation. William died in 1087 after his horse reared up and slammed the king's belly into his saddle pommel. His last words, "I commend myself to Queen Mary, the Mother of God." Not exactly the die is cast, but hey, we can't all be Caesar. Richard III's seizing of the throne, 1483. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was supposed to be the protective uncle. Instead, he became the poster child for family betrayal. When his brother, King Edward IV, died in April 1483, Richard was named Lord Protector for his 12-year-old nephew, Edward V. But Richard had other plans. On June 13th, Richard accused Lord Hastings of treason during a council meeting. Without trial, Hastings was dragged outside and beheaded on a log. Talk about a rough staff meeting. Richard then declared his brother's marriage invalid, making the young Edward V and his brother illegitimate. Convenient, right? On June 26th, Richard accepted the crown. His nephew's coronation date became his own. Edward V and his younger brother were last seen in the Tower of London. Their fate? Unknown, but let's just say their chances weren't great. Richard's coronation on July 6th was a lavish affair. The crown was so heavy it had to be held in place. Maybe it was weighed down by guilt? His reign lasted just 2 years. Turns out, killing your nephews isn't great for public relations. In August 1485, Henry Tudor invaded. Richard met him at Bosworth Field. During the battle, Richard spotted Henry and charged. He came within a sword's length of Henry before being surrounded and killed. Legend says, Richard's crown was found under a hawthorn bush and placed on Henry's head. From usurper to fertilizer in just 2 years. Richard's body was stripped and displayed in Leicester. He was buried without ceremony. In 2012, his remains were found under a car park. DNA confirmed it was Richard. His spine was curved, proving he had scoliosis. So Shakespeare wasn't entirely wrong about the hunchback thing. Richard's power grab was short-lived and bloody. He went from trusted uncle to reviled usurper in record time. His legacy? He inspired one of Shakespeare's greatest villains and ended up as the only English king to be buried in a parking lot. Napoleon Bonaparte's 100 Days. Napoleon's first stint as emperor ended with exile to Elba in 1814, but Napoleon wasn't done. He was just on a forced vacation. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon escaped Elba with 600 men. He landed in France on March 1st. Louis XVIII sent troops to intercept him. Napoleon approached the royalist forces alone. He shouted, "Here I am, kill your emperor, if you wish." The soldiers responded with, "Vive l'empereur," and joined him. Not exactly the reaction Louis XVIII was hoping for. Napoleon entered Paris on March 20th. Louis XVIII had already fled. Napoleon retook power without firing a shot. The ease of his return earned this period the nickname Vol de l'Aigle, Flight of the Eagle. Europe wasn't thrilled. The major powers declared Napoleon an outlaw and began mobilizing troops. Napoleon raised an army of 280,000 men, pretty impressive for a guy who'd been in exile a month earlier. Napoleon decided to attack before his enemies could unite. He invaded Belgium, where British and Prussian forces were gathering. On June 18th, Napoleon faced the Duke of Wellington at Waterloo. The battle was close. Napoleon's attacks almost broke the British lines, but the timely arrival of Prussian reinforcements tipped the scales. Napoleon's final gambit was to send in his elite Imperial Guard. They'd never been defeated. This time, they were. As they retreated, the cry went up, "La Garde, recule!" The Guard retreats. The French army collapsed. Napoleon returned to Paris and abdicated on June 22nd. His second reign had lasted just 111 days. This time, the British weren't taking chances. Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic. He died there in 1821. Napoleon's 100 Days shook Europe. It led to decades of French instability and strengthened the other European powers' resolve to maintain a balance of power. Santa Anna's dictatorship in Mexico, 1853. Antonio López de Santa Anna was Mexico's ultimate political chameleon. He switched sides so often, it's a wonder he didn't get whiplash. Santa Anna first became president in 1833. Over the next 20 years, he held the presidency 11 times. He was like a yo-yo, always coming back. In 1853, Santa Anna returned from exile in Colombia. He was invited to lead Mexico again, this time as dictator. Spoiler alert, it didn't end well. Santa Anna styled himself as His Serene Highness. He even made it illegal to call him anything else. Talk about an ego trip. Under Santa Anna's rule, Mexico sold 30,000 square miles to the US in the Gadsden Purchase. Price tag, $10 million. That's about 33 cents an acre. Not exactly a real estate mogul. Santa Anna's lavish lifestyle drained the treasury. He spent $30,000 on a state funeral for his amputated leg, lost in an earlier battle. Yes, you read that right, a funeral, for a leg. To raise funds, Santa Anna taxed everything. Windows, doors, dogs, you name it. He even tried to sell the Yucatan to the highest bidder. No takers, unfortunately. The final straw? Santa Anna sold more land to the U.S. without congressional approval. The plan of Ayutla Rebellion broke out in 1854. Santa Anna fled Mexico in 1855, reportedly with a sizable chunk of the treasury. He bounced around the Caribbean, always plotting his return. In 1874, he was allowed back into Mexico. He died in poverty in 1876, his dreams of power long gone. Santa Anna's last dictatorship lasted less than 2 years. In that time, he managed to lose territory, bankrupt the country, and anger pretty much everyone. His legacy? Well, he's remembered more for his failures than his successes. Oh, and he accidentally helped popularize chewing gum in the US. So there's that. Santa Anna's power grab is a textbook case of absolute power corrupts absolutely. He reached for the stars and ended up with a handful of chicle. Not exactly a success story. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte's Second French Empire, 1852. Louis Napoleon, nephew of the famous Napoleon, had big shoes to fill. He decided the best way to do that was to destroy the republic he was elected to lead. Classic Bonaparte move. In 1848, Louis Napoleon won the presidential election with 74% of the vote. His campaign slogan? Out of chaos, France has sought for order. As president, Louis Napoleon couldn't run for re-election. So, he did what any reasonable person would do. He staged a coup against himself. On December 2, 1851, he dissolved the National Assembly and arrested his opponents. A year later, he declared himself Emperor Napoleon III. The Second Empire was born. First order of business? Marrying a Spanish countess named Eugenie. Because nothing says man of the people like a fancy foreign bride. Napoleon III modernized Paris, turning medieval alleys into grand boulevards. Why? To make it harder for revolutionaries to build barricades. Urban planning meets crowd control. Foreign policy was Napoleon III's weak spot. He got France involved in the Crimean War, tried to install a puppet emperor in Mexico, it failed spectacularly, and managed to anger both sides in the American Civil War. The final blow came in 1870. Napoleon III declared war on Prussia, confident of victory. 6 weeks later, he was a prisoner and Paris was under siege. Oops! The Second Empire collapsed. Napoleon III went into exile in England, where he died 3 years later. His last words? Weren't we in Saarbrücken? Referring to his only victory in the war. Talk about living in the past. Napoleon III's power grab lasted 18 years. He took a republic and turned it into an empire only to lose it all in a war he started. He wanted to be the new Napoleon. Instead, he became a cautionary tale. His legacy? Well, Paris got some nice boulevards out of it, and France learned, again, that maybe Bonapartes and power don't mix well. Third time's the charm? Kaiser Wilhelm II's pre-World War I saber rattling, 1890 to 1914. Wilhelm II became German emperor in 1888 at age 29. He promptly fired Chancellor Bismarck, the architect of German unification, in 1890. Wilhelm declared, "There is only one master in this country, and I am he." Wilhelm had a chip on his shoulder the size of the British Empire. He was Queen Victoria's grandson, but felt snubbed by his British relatives. His solution? Build a navy to rival Britain's. In 1897, Wilhelm announced his world policy, Weltpolitik. He wanted Germany to be a global power. This included demanding colonies and building that massive navy. The British were not amused. Wilhelm's diplomacy was unique. He once called the British mad as March hares. He told the German army to fight the Boxer Rebellion in China like Huns. Great PR move there, Willie. In 1905, Wilhelm landed in Morocco, challenging French control. He hoped to drive a wedge between Britain and France. Instead, it pushed them closer together. Oops. The 1908 Daily Telegraph affair was peak Wilhelm. In an interview, he insulted pretty much everyone: the British, the Japanese, the French. The German government was horrified. Wilhelm promised to shut up. He didn't. By 1914, Wilhelm had managed to isolate Germany. His navy-building program had alienated Britain. His support for Austria-Hungary angered Russia. France was still bitter about, well, everything. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, Wilhelm gave Austria-Hungary a blank check of support against Serbia. He didn't think it would lead to war. It did. As Europe spiraled towards war in July 1914, Wilhelm tried to backpedal. Too late. The system of alliances he helped create dragged everyone into conflict. Wilhelm's power grab backfired spectacularly. He wanted Germany to be a world power. Instead, he led it into a catastrophic war. By 1918, he was in exile in the Netherlands, chopping wood and wondering where it all went wrong. His legacy? A cautionary tale about the dangers of imperial ambition and really, really bad diplomacy. Oh, and a really impressive mustache. So, there's that. Mussolini's March on Rome. Benito Mussolini, former socialist turned fascist, decided Italy needed a makeover. His plan? March on Rome with 30,000 black shirts and seize power. On October 24, 1922, Mussolini announced at a fascist rally, "Either the government will be given to us, or we will seize it by marching on Rome." Subtle. Here's the kicker. Mussolini didn't actually march. He stayed in Milan, ready to flee to Switzerland if things went south. Some leader. On October 28th, about 25,000 fascists headed to Rome. They were poorly armed and disorganized. The Italian army could have stopped them easily. But King Victor Emmanuel III refused to authorize military action. Instead, the king invited Mussolini to form a government. Mussolini arrived in Rome by sleeping car on October 30th. Not exactly a triumphant entry. Mussolini became prime minister at 39, the youngest in Italian history. He boasted, "I have buried the putrid corpse of liberty." Charming guy? The March on Rome was more myth than might. Mussolini inflated the numbers, claiming 300,000 fascists had marched. In reality, most fascists arrived in Rome by train after Mussolini took power. Mussolini's power grab worked, but it was based on bluff. The fascists weren't strong enough to take power by force. They won because the old order collapsed. Once in power, Mussolini gradually dismantled democracy. By 1925, he was dictator, calling himself Il Duce, the leader. He ruled Italy for 21 years. Mussolini's regime ended badly. In 1943, he was arrested. In 1945, he was executed by partisans and hung upside down in a Milan square. The March on Rome became fascist legend. Mussolini presented it as a triumphant revolution. In reality, it was more like a political bluff that somehow worked. Mussolini's legacy? He coined the term totalitarianism and inspired other fascist movements. Not exactly something to be proud of. Oh, and he made the trains run on time, or so they say. Hitler's failed beer hall putsch. November 8, 1923, Munich. Adolf Hitler, a 34-year-old firebrand with a distinctive mustache, decided it was time to seize power. His target? The Bürgerbraukeller, a cavernous beer hall where 3,000 people gathered to hear Gustav von Kahr speak. At 8:30 p.m., Hitler and 600 SA stormtroopers, brown-shirted thugs armed with pistols and rifles, burst in. Hitler, wearing a black frock coat and sporting a blue steel Browning pistol, leaped onto a chair. He fired a shot into the ceiling and bellowed, "The National Revolution has begun. The building is surrounded." Hitler's plan was audacious and half-baked. Step 1, kidnap Kahr and other leaders. Step 2, force them to join a March on Berlin. Step 3, overthrow the Weimar Republic. Simple, right? While Hitler was busy in the beer hall, other Nazis attempted to seize key buildings. Ernst Röhm, Hitler's stormtrooper chief, took the war ministry. Others tried for newspaper offices and military barracks. Most failed spectacularly, getting lost in Munich streets or storming the wrong buildings. By dawn, it was clear the putsch was collapsing. Kahr, initially cowed, had escaped and was rallying troops against the Nazis. Hitler, never one to quit while behind, decided to march on Munich city center anyway. Around 2,000 Nazi supporters, a motley crew of war veterans and angry young men, marched toward Marienplatz. Near the Feldherrenhalle, they met a police cordon of 100 officers armed with rifles and machine guns. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen fell dead. Hitler, who had been marching arm in arm with war hero Erich Ludendorff, hit the pavement, dislocating his shoulder. So much for leading from the front. The putsch was over in less than 24 hours. Hitler fled. but was arrested 2 days later, found hiding in a friend's attic. His subsequent trial became a national sensation. Hitler turned the courtroom into a stage, railing against the government for 4 hours straight. Sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison, Hitler served only 9 months in comfortable conditions. He used the time to dictate Mein Kampf to his loyal follower, Rudolf Hess. The failed putsch taught Hitler a crucial lesson. Destroying democracy from within was more effective than frontal assault. A decade later, in 1933, he became chancellor through legal means before swiftly dismantling the democracy that elevated him. Hitler mythologized the putsch. November 9th became a sacred Nazi holiday. The blood-stained Blutfahne, blood flag, from the march was treated as a holy relic, used to consecrate new Nazi banners. Each year, Hitler recreated the march, stopping to honor the martyrs. The Feldherrenhalle became a Nazi shrine, complete with a permanent honor guard. Passers-by had to give the Nazi salute or use Dodger's Alley, a side street for those unwilling to salute. In a final ironic twist, when Hitler came to power in 1933, he seized the Bürgerbraukeller, turning it into a Nazi venue. The site of his greatest failure became a monument to his ultimate success.